Darnell stepped out of the prison gates and into the daylight, but the world still felt small, as if the concrete walls of his former cell had somehow expanded, now enclosing the entire city. He squinted against the sun, its brightness almost mocking. There was a bag slung over his shoulder, but it weighed no more than a few pounds. Everything he owned was now reduced to the contents of that one small canvas sack. He inhaled deeply, the air of freedom tasting faintly of exhaust and rain-soaked asphalt. Freedom. The word hung in his mind, foreign, like a new language he hadn't yet mastered. He wasn't sure what it was supposed to feel like. The gates behind him clanged shut, a heavy final sound that left an aftertaste in the air. His release papers were crumpled in his jacket pocket. As he walked, the sound of their rustling seemed to echo in his ears, a constant reminder of 10 years lost to the past, 10 years behind bars, where each day had been a battle against despair and the steady erosion of hope. Time had moved differently in there. Outside, the world had continued without him, but here he was, trying to catch up with nothing but time and the memory of bars pressing on him. Darnell's steps carried him through the streets of the city, where everything seemed unfamiliar, yet unchanged. There were people, moving fast, heads down, hands clutching bags or phones or each other, none of them seeing him. The city was indifferent, its buildings towering like silent sentinels, unconcerned by the smallness of his existence. He felt like a ghost, walking through a world that didn't care if he was there or not. Freedom, he thought again. If that's what this was, it wasn't what he had expected. It tasted hollow. The halfway house was on the other side of town, in a neighborhood that had only gotten worse over the years. The kind of place where the streets hummed with quiet menace, where the sound of a car door slamming could be the prelude to something far more sinister. He'd lived here once, before prison, back when his world was just as small, but for different reasons. Back then, it had been the corners and the shadows, the gang ties that bound him tighter than any cell. He hadn't been free then, either, and now? A deep weariness settled into his bones as he neared the house. He glanced up, spotting the familiar sagging roof and chipped paint. A fresh ache bloomed in his chest. How had everything stayed the same when he had changed so much? Or had he? He wasn't sure anymore. He checked in, signed the papers with a hand that felt disconnected from his body, and climbed the narrow stairs to a room that smelled of mildew and forgotten promises. It wasn't much, but it was a bed, a place to start over. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall that seemed to press in on him, as if the world wasn't quite ready to let him be free. Time passed. Minutes, hours. The world outside moved on without him. It was dark when he finally dragged himself back onto the streets. There was no plan, only the need to escape the suffocating stillness of the room. The city at night was a different beast, alive in a way that the day could never quite capture. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows, and the hum of traffic was like a distant heartbeat, steady, but too far away to reach. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Something inside him ached with every step, a quiet voice whispering that no matter where he went, the weight of his past would follow. It clung to him like a shadow, dark and inescapable, a constant reminder of the 10 years he could never get back. As he walked, he passed a storefront window, the glass reflecting the person he had become. A gaunt face stared back at him, eyes hollow with too many years of confinement. His clothes hung on him awkwardly, as if he didn't quite fit into the world anymore. He hadn't looked in a mirror in a long time, and the sight of himself was jarring. Was this really him? The man who had survived 10 years behind bars, who had once been someone with dreams, with hope? There was a job fair tomorrow. His parole officer had told him about it. Something about reintegration programs, companies willing to give second chances. He'd heard it all before. The empty promises of a world that wanted nothing to do with him. A black man with a criminal record. Still, he had to try. What else was there? Freedom, he reminded himself, wasn't just walking out of prison. It was something you had to fight for, something you had to earn every single day. And tomorrow he would try again. The next morning came too quickly, and Darnell found himself at the job fair, standing in a long line of faces that mirrored his own weariness. He clutched a resume that felt like a lie in his hands, every line of it a reminder of what wasn't there. No real experience, just time served. One by one, the rejections piled up, each more polite than the last. They didn't even look at him long enough to hear his story, to know who he was now. It didn't matter. The system had already decided what he was worth, less than nothing. By noon, Darnell was ready to walk away, to disappear into the city and let it swallow him whole. But then a quiet voice in the back of his mind stirred. Soft at first, but insistent, growing louder with every heartbeat. For I know the plans I have for you. The words came from somewhere deep, long buried but not forgotten. He hadn't thought about that verse in a long time, but now it rang through his mind like a bell, clear and strong. Was it God? Was it hope? He didn't know, but something in him shifted. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something close to hope. He wasn't free yet, not really, but maybe, just maybe, he could be. The prison chapel had always been a strange place, quiet, unlike the rest of the world inside the walls. It was there, among the worn pews and the scent of old wood and dust, that Darnell had first encountered the whisper of something bigger than himself. The first time he went was a mistake, or so he thought. He'd been looking for an escape, not from prison, but from the constant noise that threatened to drown him. The noise in his mind? The voices of anger, regret, and fear that never seemed to stop. Someone had told him the chapel was the only place where the guards didn't hover too closely, where you could sit for an hour and just be. It wasn't peace, but it was close enough. So he went. The chaplain, a middle-aged white man with tired eyes, greeted him with a smile that Darnell didn't trust. Smiles like that didn't come free. They always cost something. He'd learned that long ago, but there was nothing else to do, and nowhere else to go. So he took a seat in the back, near the door, and waited for it to be over. But then the chaplain spoke. "Brothers," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I want to talk to you about hope." Darnell had almost laughed out loud. Hope? In a place like this? The very air seemed too heavy for something as fragile as hope. Yet the chaplain continued, undeterred by the skepticism that filled the room. "There's a verse I want to share with you today," the chaplain said, flipping open a well-worn Bible. "It's from the book of Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." The words washed over Darnell like a wave, though at the time he didn't want to admit it. He was too hardened, too broken, to believe that some ancient text had anything to say about his life. But something in him shifted that day, something deep and quiet, like the first stirrings of wind before a storm. He didn't know what it was, but it stayed with him, lingering long after he left the chapel and returned to the noise of the prison yard. He didn't go back for weeks, but the words haunted him. The idea that there could be a plan, something bigger than the choices he had made, the things he had done, was almost impossible to grasp. But it gnawed at him, and when the nights were long and the dark seemed endless, he found himself whispering the words to himself, as if they could build a wall between him and the weight of his regrets. Eventually, he returned to the chapel, not because he believed, not yet, but because he needed to understand. He needed to know if it was real, this thing called hope, this thing called faith. The chaplain didn't press him for answers. He just welcomed him back with that same smile, as if he knew something Darnell didn't. Over time, Darnell learned the language of faith. He didn't wear it like the others did, not like a shield or a badge. For him, it was more like a quiet hum beneath the surface, something that made the days a little more bearable, the nights a little less lonely. The Bible became something of a map, though he often felt lost in its pages. Still he read it, not because he expected miracles, but because it gave him something to hold on to. The chaplain talked a lot about redemption, about second chances, about how no one was too far gone for God's grace. Darnell wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that there was something left for him outside those prison walls, that he could be more than the sum of his mistakes. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Could God really have a plan for someone like him? Could he really have a future? The idea seemed too big, too much to hope for. Still, the words stayed with him, echoing through the years, growing roots in his mind. For I know the plans I have for you. They became a mantra, something he clung to when everything else fell apart. And there were plenty of times when things fell apart. Fights, lockdowns, the endless grind of time passing too slowly and too quickly all at once. He found himself praying sometimes, though it didn't always feel like praying. Sometimes it was just a thought, a whisper in the dark, a question without an answer. But it was something, and in a place like prison, something was everything. By the time his release date came, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore, but he knew one thing. He wasn't the same man who had walked through those gates all those years ago. He had changed, maybe not in ways that the world would see, but in ways that mattered to him. He had hope now, and that was something. The first few weeks after his release were harder than he had expected. The world outside was faster, colder, and less forgiving than the world inside. There were moments when he missed the routine of prison, the certainty of its walls. Out here, nothing was certain, not a job, not a place to live, not even who he was anymore. But the words were still with him, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. He held on to them like a lifeline, even when it felt like everything around him was falling apart. He applied for jobs, filling out applications with shaking hands, knowing that his past would follow him wherever he went. The rejections came quickly, each one a reminder that the world wasn't ready to forgive him, that the system wasn't built for men like him to succeed. But he kept going, because what else could he do? It was during one of those long, weary days of rejection that he found himself standing in front of a familiar door. The small, unassuming church on the corner of his old neighborhood. The same church he had walked by 1,000 times before he went to prison. The same church he had never stepped foot in back then. But now it called to him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the worn steps, the faded sign. He wasn't sure why he was there, only that he didn't know where else to go. His feet carried him forward before his mind could catch up, and before he knew it, he was inside. The place was empty, except for a single figure at the front, arranging hymnals on the pews. The man looked up as Darnell entered, and a smile spread across his face. "Welcome," the man said, his voice warm and inviting. "I'm Pastor Marcus. You're just in time." "In time for what?" Darnell asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "For whatever you need," Pastor Marcus replied. "Come on in, stay a while." Darnell hesitated, but something in the pastor's voice, something in the quiet of the church, eased the tension in his chest. He walked slowly to one of the pews, sitting down with a heavy sigh. The weight of the world seemed to lift, if only for a moment. And in that moment, he remembered the words from all those years ago. "For I know the plans I have for you." Maybe, just maybe, there was a plan after all. Darnell had thought that leaving prison would mean stepping into a new world, a world that welcomed his desire for change. He had been wrong. The world hadn't changed at all, and if it had, it wasn't for the better. The first real test came the next morning, when he walked through the doors of the job fair his parole officer had mentioned. The building was one of those hollow places, full of too much light and not enough warmth. Desks were set up in neat rows, each one manned by someone who looked both bored and impatient at the same time. Behind them, glossy posters promised opportunity, hope, and success, though none of them mentioned how you got there if the deck had already been stacked against you. Darnell stood at the entrance, staring down the rows of desks and employers, each one a gatekeeper to a future that felt impossibly far away. His hands clenched and unclenched by his sides, the muscles in his neck tightening with every second that passed. He forced himself to take a breath. Another? Then he moved forward, blending into the line of people waiting their turn. The first booth he stopped at was for a construction company. The man behind the desk didn't look up right away, focused on his clipboard. When he finally did, his smile was polite but flat, like it had been stretched too thin from overuse. "What can I do for you?" the man asked, glancing at Darnell's resume without really seeing it. "I'm looking for a job," Darnell said, keeping his voice steady, even though the familiar knot of anxiety had started to coil in his stomach. "I've got some experience with manual labor. Any certifications?" the man interrupted. Darnell hesitated. "No, but I'm a fast learner. Sorry, can't help you." The man cut in again, already turning his attention to the next person in line. "We need people with experience and certifications. Next." Darnell opened his mouth to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. The man didn't care. He had already moved on, as if Darnell didn't exist, as if he had never existed. The same thing happened at the next booth, and the next. By the fifth rejection, the polite smiles had turned into thinly veiled disdain, and the answers had become more curt, more dismissive. The truth was there, unspoken, but clear. No one was going to hire a black man with a criminal record, no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much he had changed. By noon, Darnell was ready to give up. He stood outside the building, staring at the cracked pavement beneath his feet, wondering if this was it. If this was what freedom really looked like. Rejection after rejection. A slow and painful reminder that the world wasn't built for people like him to thrive. He thought about the chaplain's words from so long ago. "For I know the plans I have for you." But what plan could possibly include this? What kind of future did God expect him to build with nothing but closed doors and empty hands? Darnell shoved his resume into his pocket and started walking, his feet carrying him without direction. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay here, in this moment, in this failure. The city stretched out before him, indifferent as always, its streets winding like veins through a body too old and too tired to care. He passed by storefronts, their windows full of things he couldn't afford. He passed people, their faces blank, their lives moving forward without him. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his past was dragging him down, pulling him back into the shadows he had fought so hard to escape. And then, almost without realizing it, he found himself back at the small church on the corner of the neighborhood he used to know. The door was open, a faint sliver of light spilling out onto the street. Inside, the sound of soft voices and the rustling of pages drifted through the air. Darnell hesitated on the sidewalk, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He hadn't planned to come back here. It had just happened, as if some invisible hand had guided his steps. Or maybe it was just habit, a desperate need for something familiar, something that didn't remind him of how far he had fallen. He stepped through the door, the warmth of the church wrapping around him like a blanket. Pastor Marcus was at the front, talking to a small group of people. He looked up as Darnell entered, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Darnell," he said, his voice welcoming, as if Darnell had been expected all along. "Good to see you, brother. Come in, have a seat." Darnell nodded stiffly and slid into a pew near the back. The church was mostly empty, just a few scattered faces here and there. He sat in the silence, the echoes of rejection still ringing in his ears. Pastor Marcus continued his quiet conversation at the front, but Darnell wasn't listening. He stared at the floor, his mind churning, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a stone. For a long time he sat there unmoving, lost in the cold reality of the world outside. The warmth of the church seemed distant, like a memory from another life. Eventually, the group at the front began to disperse, and Pastor Marcus made his way toward Darnell, his steps slow and deliberate. He sat down beside him, not saying anything at first, just sitting there, waiting. Darnell sighed, the sound long and tired. "I don't know why I came here," he muttered. "Maybe because you needed to?" Pastor Marcus said softly. Darnell shook his head. "Needed what? A reminder that nothing's changed? That I'm still the same man who walked into prison all those years ago?" Pastor Marcus looked at him thoughtfully, his eyes steady and calm. Are you? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than Darnell had expected. He stared down at his hands, his fingers clenched into fists. I don't know anymore, he admitted. I thought when I got out, things would be different, that maybe I could start over. But the world. He stopped, his voice catching in his throat. The world doesn't care. It doesn't want me. Pastor Marcus nodded slowly, as if he understood. The world's a hard place, Darnell. It'll knock you down more times than you can count. But that doesn't mean you're the same man who went in. You've changed. I can see it. Darnell scoffed. Changed how? I'm still the same guy with a criminal record, still black in a world that sees me as nothing more than that. You're more than that, Pastor Marcus said, his voice firm but gentle. You've got something in you that the world can't take away. You've got hope, faith, and that's a start. Darnell's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I don't know if I believe that anymore. That's okay, Pastor Marcus said quietly. Faith doesn't always come easy, but it's there, even when you don't feel it, even when you don't want it to be. They sat in silence for a long moment, the quiet of the church wrapping around them like a protective shell. Come by tomorrow, Pastor Marcus said eventually. We've got some things that need fixing around here. Could use an extra pair of hands. Darnell looked at him, surprised. You want me to work here? I want you to be here, Pastor Marcus corrected as we can figure out the rest as we go. Darnell didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if this was the kind of help he needed, but it was something. And right now, something was better than nothing. All right, he said finally, I'll come by. Pastor Marcus smiled, a slow, steady smile that seemed to carry a promise Darnell wasn't sure he believed in yet, but he wanted to. And maybe for now that was enough. The next morning, Darnell stood in front of the church again. The air was cool, the sky overcast, and everything around him seemed to carry the weight of expectation. The small stone building, with its faded sign and chipped paint, felt like the only thing in his life that hadn't changed or betrayed him. It was steady, solid. He didn't know why he had come back. There was a part of him that wanted to turn around, walk away, and never come back. After all, what could this place offer him? A few odd jobs, maybe? A distraction? But deep down, there was something else, an unfamiliar pull, something more than just routine or survival. He hadn't felt it in years, but it was there, like a small spark buried beneath a pile of ash. When he stepped inside, the church was quiet, just as it had been the night before. The worn wooden pews gleamed faintly in the muted light filtering through the windows, and the scent of old wood and dust hung in the air like a memory. It was a place that had seen countless stories of brokenness and redemption, a place that seemed to echo with the unspoken prayers of those who had come before him. Pastor Marcus appeared from one of the back rooms, wiping his hands on a rag. He greeted Darnell with a nod and a smile, as if he had expected him all along. Glad you made it, he said, his voice warm, steady. I could use the help. Darnell shifted awkwardly, still unsure of his place here. What do you need? Pastor Marcus motioned toward a side room. The storage room's a mess. We've been meaning to organize it for a while now, but there's never enough time. Figured today's as good a day as any to get started. It wasn't much of a task, but that was fine. Darnell didn't need much. He just needed something to do. Something to take his mind off the gnawing ache of rejection and failure. So he followed the pastor to the small cluttered room at the back of the church. Boxes were stacked haphazardly. Old hymnals and decorations from long-forgotten events. It smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten things. For the next hour, Darnell worked in silence, sorting through the piles, stacking things neatly in the corners, trying not to think too much about the larger mess that was his life. Pastor Marcus stayed nearby, helping occasionally, but mostly just letting Darnell work in peace. When they finally took a break, Pastor Marcus handed Darnell a bottle of water and sat down on a nearby stool, watching him carefully. You seem a little more at ease today, he said after a moment. Darnell shrugged. I guess it's quiet here. That it is. Pastor Marcus agreed, smiling faintly. Quiet's important. Gives us space to think. Darnell didn't respond. He'd been thinking too much lately, and most of his thoughts weren't the kind he wanted to dwell on. But something about this place, about the quiet, about the way Pastor Marcus didn't push too hard, allowed him to let his guard down just a little. "You ever think about what comes next?" Pastor Marcus asked, suddenly catching Darnell off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's the plan?" Pastor Marcus gestured vaguely. "You've been through a lot. I'm guessing you've got dreams, things you want to do now that you've got a chance." Darnell let out a short, humorless laugh. "Dreams? I'm just trying to get by, man. I don't have time for dreams." Pastor Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected that answer. "I get it. Life's been hard. You're just trying to survive. But surviving isn't enough, Darnell. You've got to live." Darnell stared down at the floor, his hands gripping the bottle of water tightly. Live? How was he supposed to live when every door he tried to open was slammed in his face? How was he supposed to think about the future when his past was still weighing him down like an anchor? "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he admitted quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "That's all right," Pastor Marcus said. "You don't have to know right now. But I do know this. You're not alone. God's got a plan for you, even if you can't see it yet." Darnell felt the familiar twinge of doubt creep into his mind. It was the same thing the chaplain had said all those years ago, the same message that had carried him through some of the darkest moments of his life. But now, outside the prison walls, it felt distant, unreal. "I don't know if I believe that anymore," Darnell said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Marcus didn't seem surprised. He just nodded again, his eyes thoughtful. "It's okay to have doubts. Faith isn't always easy, but just because you can't see the plan doesn't mean it isn't there. Sometimes it takes time, and sometimes it takes a leap of faith." Darnell frowned, his hands tightening around the bottle. A leap of faith? He had already taken so many leaps, and each time he had fallen harder than before. But Pastor Marcus spoke with a quiet certainty that made Darnell wonder, just for a moment, if maybe, just maybe, he was right. Before Darnell could respond, the church door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a neatly pressed suit, but his eyes were sharp, full of life. He spotted Pastor Marcus and grinned. "Marcus, my friend," the man called, his voice booming in the quiet space. "Good to see you." Pastor Marcus smiled warmly and rose to greet the man, shaking his hand. "Mr. Harris, it's been too long." Darnell watched as the two men exchanged pleasantries, feeling suddenly out of place. He had been content in the quiet, but this new presence was loud and full of energy, like a jolt to the system. "Who's this?" Mr. Harris asked, turning his sharp gaze to Darnell. "This is Darnell," Pastor Marcus said, clapping Darnell on the shoulder. "He's been helping out around here." Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes appraising. "Nice to meet you, Darnell. I'm Harris Marcus, and I go way back. Used to run a business together back before he found his true calling." Darnell nodded stiffly, unsure what to say. There was something about Mr. Harris that made him feel small, like he was being sized up. "So what's your story?" Mr. Harris asked, his tone casual but curious. Darnell hesitated, glancing at Pastor Marcus, who gave him a reassuring nod. "I just got out of prison a few weeks ago," he said, his voice low. "I'm trying to figure things out." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow, but there was no judgment in his expression. "Trying to figure things out, huh? Well, I've been there, my friend. Been there, done that." Darnell blinked, surprised. "You?" Mr. Harris smiled knowingly. "Yep. Did my time, got out, and had to start over from scratch. Ain't easy, but it's possible. You just need the right tools." "The right tools?" Mr. Harris leaned in slightly, his eyes gleaming. "Yeah, tools like faith, determination, and a good business plan." Darnell wasn't sure if Mr. Harris was serious or not, but the man's words seemed to carry weight. He could feel the intensity behind them, as if Mr. Harris knew something Darnell didn't. Pastor Marcus smiled at Darnell. "Harris here runs a successful business now. Landscaping, property management, you name it. He's been through the fire just like you, and now he helps others find their way. Mr. Harris nodded. You ever think about starting your own business, Darnell? The question caught Darnell off guard. My own business? Yeah, your own thing. Something you can build with your hands. Something that belongs to you. Darnell stared at him, unsure how to respond. The idea seemed impossible. I wouldn't know where to start, Mr. Harris smiled, his eyes gleaming with something that looked a lot like hope. That's where I come in. If you're willing to take a chance on yourself, I'll help you. I'll teach you what you need to know, but it's gotta be your decision. Darnell's heart raced in his chest. Was this real? Was this the leap of faith Pastor Marcus had been talking about? He didn't know, but there was something about Mr. Harris's offer, something about the way Pastor Marcus was watching him, that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, this was a step he could take. A glimmer of hope flickered inside him, faint but undeniable. Maybe this was the plan after all. Darnell sat across from Mr. Harris in a small diner a few blocks from the church. The clatter of dishes and low murmur of conversations filled the air. But to Darnell, it was all distant noise. His mind was still spinning from Mr. Harris's offer. From the casual yet intense way he had suggested something as impossible as starting his own business. He had spent most of his life working for others, or more accurately, being pushed around by others. The idea of doing something for himself felt foreign, like trying to imagine a new world with no map to guide him. Mr. Harris watched him carefully, his sharp eyes taking in every flicker of doubt that crossed Darnell's face. Look, I know it sounds big, Harris said, leaning back in his seat, his voice calm but insistent. But that's the point. It is big. You've spent too long thinking small, Darnell. That's what the system wants. Keep you small, keep you down. I'm saying you can break out of that. Darnell stared at the table, the smell of greasy food rising around him. He felt that old familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he had when he stepped out of prison and the world seemed too wide, too fast, and too unforgiving. Why me? He asked finally, lifting his eyes to meet Mr. Harris's. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Harris chuckled, the sound deep and warm, like he had been expecting the question. I don't need to know your whole story to see what's in front of me. I've been where you are, Darnell. I see the same look in your eyes that I had when I got out. You're hungry for something more, even if you don't realize it yet. And maybe I don't know you, but I know the system. I know what it does to men like us. You want to break free from that. You need someone to show you the way, someone who's done it. Darnell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The truth was, he didn't know what he wanted. He wanted a job, sure, some kind of stability, but a business. That seemed too far out of reach, like grasping at the horizon. I don't even know where to start, Darnell muttered, feeling the weight of his own doubts. That's why I'm here, Harris said, his voice steady and confident. I'll teach you, but you have to be willing to take that first step. No one's going to hand it to you. Not the system, not the world. You gotta take it for yourself. For a long moment, Darnell didn't speak. He was trying to picture it. His own business, something he could build with his hands, something that was his. He couldn't see it yet, but there was a part of him that wanted to. A part of him that wanted to believe in the possibility, even if it was just a spark. What kind of business, he asked, his voice quieter now, hesitant, but curious. Harris smiled, that knowing look in his eyes again. Something simple to start. Landscaping. Lawn care, maybe. I've got a couple of contracts already. You can start small. Take on some work from me. Get your feet wet. We'll talk about tools. About managing money. You learn how to handle the small jobs first. Then we build from there. Before you know it, you'll be running your own crew. Darnell blinked, feeling a rush of thoughts all at once. Landscaping. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something he could wrap his head around. He had done odd jobs before, working with his hands, clearing yards, fixing things up. It wasn't foreign to him, but still the idea of it being his business, his responsibility, it felt like a huge leap. You make it sound easy. Darnell said, a hint of skepticism creeping into his voice. Oh, it's not easy, Harris said, his tone turning serious. It's work. Hard work, but it's yours. And that's the difference. No one can take that from you. You want to be free? Really free? You've got to build something no one else can control. Darnell nodded slowly, the words sinking in. There was something powerful in the way Harris spoke about freedom. Not the kind of freedom Darnell had thought about before. Freedom from prison, freedom from the system, but a deeper freedom, the kind that meant control over your own life. That was the kind of freedom he had never known. All right, Darnell said finally, his voice low but firm. I'll give it a shot. Harris grinned, a wide, genuine smile. That's what I like to hear. The next few days were a whirlwind. Darnell started by shadowing Mr. Harris on some of his smaller jobs, learning the basics of what it took to run a landscaping business. Harris wasn't just teaching him how to mow lawns and trim hedges. He was teaching him about the behind-the-scenes work, the business side of things, how to price jobs, how to handle clients, how to manage the money that came in and make sure it stretched far enough to cover costs. It was overwhelming at first. Darnell had always been good with his hands, but the business side of things was a whole new world. There were numbers, invoices, tools to buy, and time to manage. But Harris was patient, showing him the ropes without rushing him. Each day, Darnell learned something new. And with each new lesson, the idea of owning his own business started to feel just a little more real. One afternoon, as they worked on a job clearing a yard, Harris turned to Darnell and handed him a pair of shears. Your turn, he said, motioning to the overgrown hedges that lined the yard. Let's see what you've got. Darnell hesitated for a moment, then took the shears. He moved to the hedges, eyeing the mess of branches and leaves, and started trimming. At first, his movements were cautious, unsure. But as he worked, something shifted. The rhythm of the work took over. The steady snip, snip, snip of the shears as he shaped the hedges, his hands moving more confidently with each cut. When he finished, Harris stepped back, nodding in approval. Not bad, he said. You've got a good eye. And you're quick. That'll serve you well. Darnell wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just the physical work. It was the knowledge that he was building something. Slowly, piece by piece, he was learning, growing. That evening, after they finished the job, Harris pulled Darnell aside. I've got a contract coming up next week, he said. It's small, but it's steady work. How would you feel about taking it on yourself? I'll still be around to guide you, but I think you're ready to start running a job on your own. Darnell felt his heart skip a beat. Running a job on his own? The thought was terrifying and thrilling all at once. But then, a part of him, the part that had always been afraid of failing, of stepping outside his comfort zone, whispered doubt. What if I mess up? He asked, his voice betraying the fear he was trying to suppress. Harris chuckled. You're going to mess up, Darnell. That's part of it, but that's how you learn. And the more you mess up, the better you get. You've got to trust yourself. You've got the skills. Now you just need the confidence. Darnell nodded, still feeling the weight of the decision, but knowing deep down that this was the leap of faith he needed to take. He had been standing at the edge for too long, looking out at the possibility of something more, but never daring to jump. All right, he said quietly, I'll do it. Harris smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. That's the spirit. Now, let's get you ready. The next few days were filled with preparations. Harris walked Darnell through the details of the job, showing him how to organize the tools, how to schedule the work, and how to communicate with the client. It wasn't just about the physical labor. It was about running the whole operation. The day before the job started, Darnell stood outside the church, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Pastor Marcus came out of the building, noticing the look on Darnell's face. Big day tomorrow, Marcus said, smiling. Darnell nodded, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and fear. Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready. Marcus chuckled softly. No one ever feels ready. But you're not doing this alone, Darnell. You've got people who believe in you, and you've got your faith. Darnell looked down, the familiar words echoing in his mind. "For I know the plans I have for you." He had heard those words so many times, but now, for the first time, they felt like more than just a distant promise. They felt real. He nodded, feeling a small, quiet resolve settle inside him. "I'll give it my best." "That's all anyone can ask for," Marcus said, his smile warm. "God's with you, Darnell, and so are we." Darnell left the church that evening with a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Tomorrow, he would take the first step into something new, something that was his, and that was all the hope he needed. The morning came earlier than expected. Darnell woke to the pale light filtering through the thin curtains of his small room at the halfway house, his heart beating in time with the anxious buzz of thoughts swirling in his head. This was it. The first day of the job Mr. Harris had entrusted to him. It felt like a door had opened just a crack, and now it was up to him to walk through it, to push it open wide enough for something bigger to follow. He glanced at the old clock on the wall, its ticking steady, as if mocking his own uncertainty. It was still early, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep any longer. The unease in his gut kept him alert. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, itched to get moving, to feel the tools in them again, to do something, anything that might still that familiar hum of doubt. Darnell dressed quickly, pulling on the work clothes Mr. Harris had given him, the worn fabric smelling faintly of fresh air and grass. As he left the house, the city was still waking up, the streets quiet, except for the distant hum of early morning traffic. It felt strange, this calm before the work began, like the world itself was giving him a moment of stillness before the day truly kicked off. The yard Darnell had been hired to clean up wasn't far. A small residential property that had been neglected for months. Overgrown grass and hedges threatened to swallow the house, and the weeds in the front garden had spread like a slow, creeping shadow. The sight of it should have overwhelmed him, but instead, Darnell felt a strange sense of purpose. There was something about it that reminded him of his own life. Unruly, messy, but not beyond saving. He arrived before the client did, the silence of the empty yard amplifying the tension in his chest. The tools Harris had loaned him were waiting in the back of a small trailer parked along the curb. He grabbed the lawnmower, testing its weight in his hands, feeling the solid, reliable heft of it. "You've got this," he told himself, though the words felt shaky in his mind. He had been given the tools, the knowledge, the chance, but now came the part where he would prove whether or not he could handle it. A soft sound behind him interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a woman standing on the porch, probably in her late 30s, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, her eyes surveying the yard with the kind of weary acceptance that people wore when they had long ago stopped hoping for quick solutions. "Darnell, right?" she called, stepping down from the porch. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. She extended a hand. "I'm Melissa. Glad you're here. This yard's been a disaster since last summer. You think you can work some magic?" Darnell smiled, though it was small, still uncertain. "We'll get it looking good again. Might take a little time, but we'll get there." She smiled back, and for a moment, the doubt loosened its grip on his chest. "That's all I can ask for," she said. "I'll be inside if you need anything. Just let me know." Darnell nodded as she disappeared back into the house. He stood there for a moment longer, taking in the yard, letting the magnitude of the job settle in, and then, with a deep breath, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The first couple of hours passed in a blur of steady, focused effort. The hum of the lawnmower cut through the overgrown grass, and Darnell's hands moved in a rhythm that felt natural, almost meditative. The simple, repetitive motion of clearing the lawn, of trimming the edges, gave him something to focus on, something to ground him. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the sweat began to bead on his forehead, but he didn't mind. The physical exertion felt good, like he was working out more than just the yard's tangles. He was untangling something inside himself, too. By midday, he had made significant progress. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the wild hedges were cut back, and the yard was beginning to look less like an overgrown mess and more like a place where someone lived. He wiped the sweat from his brow, pausing to admire his work. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was on its way. As he stood there catching his breath, Mr. Harris pulled up in his truck. He climbed out, sunglasses perched on his nose, and walked over to where Darnell stood, surveying the yard with an approving nod. "Looking good," Harris said, his voice full of satisfaction. "I knew you had it in you." Darnell felt a small surge of pride at Harris's words, though he tried to play it cool. "Still got a bit left to do," he said, motioning to the flower beds that needed weeding. Harris smiled. "That's how it always is. There's always something left to do. But you're getting there. That's what matters." Darnell nodded, feeling the truth in Harris's words. He was getting there, slowly but surely. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was actually moving forward, like the future wasn't just some distant thing he couldn't reach. Harris clapped him on the shoulder. "You keep this up, and we'll have more work coming your way. Folks see a job well done, and word spreads. You build your reputation 1 yard at a time." Darnell nodded again, the weight of those words sinking in. 1 yard at a time, 1 step at a time. That was how he was going to do this. Not by thinking too far ahead, not by worrying about what came next, but by focusing on what was right in front of him. "Thanks, Harris," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than they seemed to. Harris smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Don't thank me yet. You're the one doing the work." With that, Harris left, and Darnell returned to the task at hand, feeling lighter than he had in days. The doubts that had plagued him that morning were still there, lingering in the background, but they didn't seem as loud anymore. He could do this. He was doing this. By the end of the day, the yard was transformed. The overgrown grass was neatly trimmed, the hedges shaped, and the weeds pulled from the flower beds. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from what it had been that morning. Melissa came out of the house just as Darnell was finishing up, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude as she looked around the yard. "Wow," she said, her voice full of admiration. "It looks amazing. I can't believe how much you got done in just 1 day." Darnell smiled, feeling that unfamiliar surge of pride again. "Still some work to do, but it's coming along." Melissa nodded, clearly impressed. "I'll definitely be calling you again. You've done a great job." "Thank you," Darnell said, the words feeling solid and real, like they belonged to him now. As he packed up his tools and loaded them into the trailer, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of accomplishment washing over him. It wasn't just about the yard. It was about something deeper, something that had been missing for so long. The yard was like his own life, a mess, but not beyond saving. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, Darnell drove home with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He still had a long way to go. There were still hurdles ahead, still challenges to face. But now, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was building something. He was moving forward. And for now, that was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of long days and hard work. But it was the kind of work Darnell had come to enjoy. Work that made his muscles ache, but left his mind clear. The sense of accomplishment he'd felt after his first job stuck with him, growing with each new yard he took on. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. Just like Mr. Harris had said it would, neighbors talked. People noticed when things looked good. And soon, Darnell had a steady stream of clients calling for his services. Each new job was a small victory, a step towards something bigger than just landscaping. It was his chance to prove, to himself, to the world, that he wasn't the man he had once been. The physical labor kept his mind focused, and the work gave him something he hadn't had in years: control. On his own time, Darnell had started researching more about the landscaping business. He'd visit the library or use the public computer at the halfway house, reading about different techniques, tools, and even pricing strategies. Mr. Harris was a wealth of knowledge too, always ready to offer advice or lend a hand when Darnell needed it. Harris's mentorship became the foundation that helped Darnell push through the days when the doubt crept back in, when the old voices whispered that this was temporary, that the world didn't really want him to succeed, but Harris's lessons were about more than just the work. He was teaching Darnell how to be smart with his money, how to build a business that didn't just survive, but grew. It was a new kind of education, one Darnell had never been exposed to growing up. Saving, investing, managing expenses. It all felt foreign, like learning a new language. But with each conversation, each new lesson, Darnell started to see the bigger picture. He wasn't just mowing lawns. He was building something sustainable, something that could last. It wasn't long before Darnell was handling jobs on his own, without needing to check in with Harris after each one. He started developing a rhythm, gathering the tools, driving to the job, talking to the client about their vision for their yard, and then getting to work. As the weeks went by, he realized he wasn't just working for other people's approval anymore. He was working for himself. One afternoon, after finishing a particularly difficult job, Darnell sat in his truck, wiping the sweat from his brow and staring at his hands. They were calloused, rough from the tools and the dirt, but they felt like his hands now, not the hands of a man who had spent 10 years behind bars. These were hands that built things, that shaped the world around him. Slowly but surely, he was reclaiming himself 1 yard at a time. As the small victories piled up, something else began to take root in Darnell's life. Confidence. The kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from knowing your worth. He hadn't had that in years, hadn't felt like he was worth anything, really. But now, every job completed, every satisfied client, was a reminder that he could do this, that. He was doing this. One evening, after a long day of work, Darnell met up with Harris at a local diner. The place was small and unremarkable, the kind of spot that people passed without noticing, but it had become their unofficial meeting place. Darnell had something on his mind, something that had been brewing quietly for weeks now, but he wasn't sure how to bring it up. As they sat down, Harris, always quick to read people, looked at Darnell with a raised brow. "Something's on your mind," he said, not even bothering to phrase it as a question. Darnell leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah," he admitted. "I've been thinking about growing, expanding, maybe." Harris nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's a good sign. Means you're ready." Darnell hesitated, the doubt creeping back in. "I don't know if I am. I mean, I've barely got this figured out." "You're never going to have it all figured out," Harris said, his tone calm but firm. "No one ever does. But you've got the foundation. You've got the work ethic. And now you've got the experience. You can start thinking bigger." Darnell chewed on that for a moment, the idea settling in. It wasn't like he was looking to build some huge empire, but he was starting to get more calls than he could handle alone. And as much as he wanted to take on every job, he knew he couldn't be everywhere at once. That's when the idea had hit him. What if he hired someone? Just one other person to help him manage the workload. It was a small step, but it felt like a big leap. "I was thinking about bringing someone on," Darnell said carefully, watching Harris's reaction. "Not full-time or anything, just some extra hands for the bigger jobs." Harris's face broke into a grin. "That's exactly what you should be thinking about. That's how you grow. You can't do it all alone." "But I've never hired anyone before," Darnell admitted. "How do I even do that? How do I know if I can afford it?" "That's where the business side comes in," Harris said, leaning forward. "You start by looking at your numbers. You've been saving, right? You've got a little cushion?" Darnell nodded. Harris had drilled that into him from the start. Save every chance you get. Build a buffer so that when opportunities come, you're ready for them. Harris pulled a small notepad from his pocket and scribbled something down. You start small. You don't have to hire someone full-time right away. You bring someone on for a few jobs, see how it goes. You pay them fair, but make sure it fits into your budget, and don't be afraid to ask for help. Darnell took the notepad and stared at the numbers Harris had jotted down. It looked doable, but the thought of being responsible for someone else's paycheck felt heavy. It was one thing to run his own life, but to take someone else's livelihood into his hands? That was another level. "I don't want to screw this up," Darnell said quietly. Harris gave him a steady look. You won't. You've got good instincts, Darnell. And more than that, you care. That's what makes you different. That's why people trust you. Just take it one step at a time. Darnell nodded, still processing it all, one step at a time. That's how he'd gotten this far. Maybe it was enough to take that same approach with this next phase. A few weeks later, Darnell found himself standing in front of the first guy he had hired. His name was Marcus, a younger guy who had come from a rough background, similar to Darnell's. He was green, still learning the ropes, but he had the same hunger Darnell had once felt. Darnell saw it in his eyes the first time they met, the desire to prove himself, to break free from the cycle that had kept him down for so long. The first few jobs they worked together were rocky, with Marcus needing a lot of guidance, but Darnell didn't mind. He remembered what it was like to be starting over, to be learning from scratch. As Marcus's confidence grew, so did Darnell's. He wasn't just doing the work anymore. He was leading, teaching, and guiding someone else along the same path he had walked. The small victories kept coming, each one building on the last. With Marcus's help, Darnell was able to take on bigger jobs, which meant more income, which meant more savings. He started thinking about new equipment, new opportunities, new possibilities. But it wasn't just about the business. It was about the way people looked at him now. The way they saw him, not as a man defined by his past, but as someone who was building something, someone who was going somewhere. The clients who hired him didn't ask about where he had been or what he had done. They only saw the work he was doing now. And that, more than anything, gave him a sense of freedom he hadn't known before. One evening, after wrapping up a job, Darnell stood on the front porch of a client's house, looking out over the yard he had just transformed. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the grass, and for a moment, everything felt still, perfect. He thought about how far he had come, about the small steps that had led him here. Each one had felt insignificant at the time, but now, looking back, he could see how they had all added up to something bigger than he had imagined. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and with every small victory, every big step, he was moving closer to the future he had once thought was impossible. Darnell had never been one to get too comfortable. He knew from experience that the moment you started to feel like you had everything under control, life had a way of reminding you that it wasn't so simple. And yet, as the months went by and his business grew, he found himself starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going his way. He and Marcus had hit a groove. The jobs were coming in steady, the money was flowing, and the clients were happy. Darnell had even managed to upgrade some of his equipment, thanks to the savings Harris had pushed him to build. It wasn't much, just a new lawnmower and some more efficient trimmers, but it made a world of difference. The work was faster, easier, and more professional. For the first time, Darnell felt like he wasn't just scraping by. He was thriving. But then came the city contract. It was the kind of opportunity that could take Darnell's business to the next level. The city had put out a bid for landscaping work on several public properties, parks, medians, and a few government buildings. It was a big job, much bigger than anything Darnell had tackled before, but Harris had been the one to push him toward it. You've got the skills, the team, and the equipment now, Harris had said, his eyes gleaming with that familiar fire. This is your shot. It's time to go big. Darnell had hesitated at first. The city contract wasn't just about doing a good job. It was about navigating the bureaucracy, submitting the right paperwork, and making sure all the legalities were in order. It felt like another world, one he wasn't sure he belonged in. But Harris had helped him with the application, walked him through the process, and assured him that he was more than capable of handling it. So Darnell had submitted his bid. It was a fair offer, competitive but reasonable, with enough of a margin to make sure he could pay Marcus, keep the business running smoothly, and still take home a decent profit. The numbers were solid, the proposal tight. He had every reason to believe he had a real shot at this. Weeks passed, and Darnell tried to push the thought of the contract to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the steady stream of jobs he and Marcus were completing. But every now and then, late at night when the city was quiet and the work was done, his thoughts would drift back to the bid. He could see it, clear as day. His company's name on the trucks, his team working on city property, his business growing beyond the small yards and residential jobs he had started with. The day the letter came, Darnell's heart raced with anticipation. He had been waiting for this, had allowed himself to dream about what it could mean. He opened the envelope with shaky hands, scanning the letter quickly, his eyes darting over the official language and formalities. "We regret to inform you that..." Darnell stopped reading. The words blurred in front of him, their meaning hitting him harder than he had expected. He had been rejected. He sat down on the edge of his bed, the letter still clutched in his hand. It didn't make sense. He had done everything right, submitted everything on time, put together a solid proposal. What had gone wrong? That evening, Darnell met with Harris at the diner. The rejection letter folded in his pocket. Harris was already seated when he arrived, sipping his usual black coffee. When Darnell slid into the booth, his face must have said it all because Harris looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "What happened?" Harris asked, setting his coffee down. "They rejected the bid," Darnell said flatly, pulling the letter from his pocket and tossing it onto the table. No explanation, just a rejection. Harris picked up the letter, reading through it quickly. His expression didn't change much, but Darnell could see the gears turning behind his eyes. "That doesn't make sense," Harris said after a moment. "Your numbers were good. Your proposal was solid. What reason did they give?" "None," Darnell said, his frustration seeping through. "Just the usual formalities." Harris leaned back in his seat, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Let me make some calls," he said. "I know some people who might be able to tell us what's really going on here." Darnell nodded, feeling a mixture of frustration and hope. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was Harris. It took a few days for Harris to get back to Darnell, but when he did, the news wasn't good. "It's about your record," Harris said over the phone, his voice low. "They didn't reject your bid because of the numbers or the proposal. It's because you've got a criminal record. The city has a policy. No contracts for anyone with a felony conviction." Darnell's stomach sank. He had known deep down that his past would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pull him back down. But he had thought, hoped, that maybe, just maybe, he could outrun it. That if he worked hard enough, built something good enough, it wouldn't matter anymore. That's ridiculous," Darnell said, his voice shaking with anger. "I did the time. I've changed. How long do they get to hold that over me?" Harris sighed. "I know. It's not fair, but it's the system, man. It's rigged to keep people like us down." The words hit Darnell hard. He had known the system was stacked against him. He had known it since the day he was born, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. He had done everything right. He had built something from nothing, and yet it still wasn't enough. "So what do I do?" Darnell asked, his voice quieter now, the fire draining out of him. "Just give up? Keep working small jobs? Never grow?" Harris was silent for a moment. Then his voice came through the line, strong and steady. "No, you don't give up, you fight." "Fight? Against what?" Darnell asked bitterly. "The system? The law? How am I supposed to fight something like that?" "You fight with the tools you've got," Harris said. "You've got your business. You've got people who believe in you, and you've got your faith. That's more than a lot of people have. But most importantly, you've got the truth on your side. You did the time. You've earned the right to move on with your life. And I know just the people who can help you make that case." Darnell sat in silence, processing Harris's words. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but now there was something else, too. A spark of defiance, a stubborn refusal to let the system win. "What do I need to do?" Darnell asked finally. Harris smiled, though Darnell couldn't see it over the phone. "Leave that to me. I've got a lawyer friend who deals with stuff like this all the time. We're going to challenge this policy. We're going to make sure they can't keep holding your past over your head." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and consultations with Harris's lawyer friend. The process was slow, frustratingly so, But Darnell stayed focused, determined not to let the system beat him down again. He kept working his regular jobs, kept building his business, even as the shadow of the city contract loomed over him. Through it all, Pastor Marcus had been a constant source of support. Darnell found himself spending more time at the church, not just working, but talking to Marcus, letting the pastor's calm presence and quiet wisdom help him through the days when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. "You've come a long way," Marcus said one evening after they had finished tidying up the churchyard. "Don't let this setback make you forget that." "I'm trying," Darnell said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it feels like no matter how far I come, there's always something waiting to knock me back down." "That's the world we live in," Marcus said with a sigh. "But you've got something stronger than the world, Darnell. You've got your faith, and that's going to carry you through this." Darnell didn't respond right away, but he felt the truth in Marcus's words. The pastor had been there since the beginning, watching him grow, watching him struggle, and through it all, Marcus had never wavered in his belief that Darnell was capable of more than the world wanted to give him credit for. As Darnell drove home that night, he thought about all the times he had wanted to give up, all the times the system had tried to pull him back down. But he hadn't given up. He had kept fighting, kept pushing forward, and now, even though the odds were stacked against him again, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. Darnell found himself sitting across from Harris's lawyer friend in a cramped office downtown, the walls lined with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Jasmine Carter, was flipping through the paperwork Darnell had signed for the city bid. She had a calm, methodical way about her that put Darnell a little more at ease. Though the tension from the rejection still weighed heavily on his shoulders, Jasmine adjusted her glasses and leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the armrest as she considered her next words. "The city's policy is outdated, no doubt about that. There are ways to challenge it, but it's not going to be a quick process." Darnell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected that, but hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. "So what's the next step?" he asked. "Well," Jasmine began, "we can file an appeal. But we're not just fighting your rejection here. We're challenging the entire policy. The city's been using this clause for years to quietly exclude people with criminal records from contracts. It's systemic. But that means if we win, we're not just opening the door for you. We're opening it for a lot of people." Darnell felt a flicker of hope at her words. He wasn't the only one who had been caught in this trap. If they could change this, it could be bigger than just his business. It could mean opportunities for others like him, men and women trying to rebuild their lives after prison, only to find that the world still held them at arm's length. "What are the chances we actually win?" Darnell asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jasmine leaned forward, her expression serious. "It won't be easy. The city's going to fight back. They always do. But we've got a strong case. You've got a solid business, no issues since your release, and we can show that you're more than capable of handling the contract. We can argue that this policy is outdated, discriminatory, and unfairly punishes people for crimes they've already served time for." Darnell nodded, trying to take it all in. It wasn't just about fighting for a contract anymore. It was about fighting for a future, not just for himself, but for others who were in the same position. The thought of that responsibility weighed on him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose. This wasn't just his battle. It was bigger than him. "I'm in," he said firmly, meeting Jasmine's gaze. "Whatever it takes." Jasmine smiled, a small but confident smile. "Good. I'll file the paperwork and get things rolling. It's going to take some time, but we'll get there." As Darnell left the office, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. There was a long road ahead, but at least now he had a path to follow. And for the first time since the rejection, he felt like he wasn't walking that path alone. The days stretched into weeks as the appeal process moved forward, slowly but steadily. Darnell kept busy with his regular jobs, but the weight of the fight with the city was always in the back of his mind. He knew that this battle wasn't just about the contract. It was about proving to himself and to the world that he was more than the mistakes of his past. But the waiting, the uncertainty, wore on him. One evening, after finishing a particularly grueling day's work, Darnell found himself back at Pastor Marcus's church. He hadn't planned on stopping by, but something about the stillness of the evening and the weight of everything he had been carrying brought him to those familiar steps. The church was quiet, the last rays of sunlight casting soft shadows through the stained glass windows. Pastor Marcus was inside, as usual, tidying up the pews and humming to himself as he worked. When he saw Darnell, he smiled warmly. "Good to see you," Marcus said, motioning for Darnell to come in. "How have you been holding up?" Darnell shrugged, the weariness of the past few weeks catching up with him. "It's been tough," he admitted. "Feels like I'm fighting this battle against the city. But it's more than that. It's like I'm fighting against everything. My past, the system, the way people see me. Some days, I don't know if I can keep going." Pastor Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's how it feels sometimes, like the world stacked against you, and every step forward comes with 2 steps back." "Exactly," Darnell said, his voice thick with frustration. "I'm doing everything I can. I'm trying to do things right, to build something good, but it never seems like enough." Marcus paused for a moment, then sat down on one of the pews, gesturing for Darnell to join him. "I've been thinking a lot about faith lately," he said softly. "How easy it is to talk about having faith when things are going well, when life's smooth, but real faith, the kind that gets you through the hardest moments, that's something different. It's not about believing when everything's easy. It's about holding on when everything's falling apart." Darnell stared at the floor, his hands clasped in front of him. He knew Marcus was right, but that didn't make it any easier. Marcus continued, his voice quiet but firm. "You've come a long way, Darnell. Don't forget that. You've built something out of nothing. You've worked hard, done everything right, and even when the world tries to tell you that you don't deserve a second chance, you keep going. That's faith, that's strength." Darnell let Marcus's words sink in. He had been so focused on the fight with the city, on the unfairness of it all, that he had forgotten to take stock of what he had already achieved. He had built a business from the ground up. He had found a way to move forward despite everything. And he had people who believed in him. Marcus, Harris, even Jasmine. He wasn't alone in this. "Thanks, Marcus," Darnell said quietly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "I needed that." Marcus smiled. "We all need reminders sometimes. Just remember, God's got a plan for you, even if you can't see it yet." Darnell nodded, the familiar words bringing a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could face it with a little more hope. The day of the hearing finally arrived. Darnell sat in a small stuffy room in the city's administrative offices, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Jasmine sat beside him, her expression calm and focused as they waited for the city officials to review the case. Darnell's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the moment that could change everything. The city's legal team presented their case first, arguing that the policy was in place to protect the integrity of the city's contracts. They used words like public safety and reputation. But Darnell knew what it really was. Discrimination, pure and simple. When it was Jasmine's turn to speak, she was sharp, direct, and unflinching. She argued that the policy was outdated, that it unfairly punished people who had already paid their debt to society, and that it perpetuated the very cycle of poverty and recidivism that the city claimed to want to fight. She spoke about Darnell's business, about the work he had done to rebuild his life, and about the opportunities that people like him deserved. Darnell sat silently, listening to Jasmine's words, feeling both hope and fear swirling in his chest. He had done everything he could now. It was in the hands of the officials. After what felt like an eternity, the lead official, a stern-looking man with graying hair, spoke. "We will review the arguments presented today and make our decision in the coming weeks." It wasn't the answer Darnell had hoped for. He had wanted a decision right then and there, a clear win or loss. But it was out of his hands now. As they left the office, Jasmine turned to Darnell and gave him a reassuring smile. You did great. Now we wait. The waiting would be the hardest part. The following weeks felt like a test of Darnell's faith. He went about his business, working the usual jobs, mentoring Marcus, and continuing to grow his company. But the uncertainty of the city's decision loomed over him. He kept in touch with Harris and Marcus, both of whom encouraged him to stay strong. But the waiting gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how fragile everything still felt. One evening, after finishing a job, Darnell sat in his truck, staring at his phone. Jasmine had promised to call as soon as she heard anything, but the days had stretched into weeks with no word. He clenched his fists, trying to fight back the familiar frustration, the sense of helplessness that had haunted him since the rejection. And then, just as he was about to turn the key in the ignition, his phone buzzed. It was Jasmine. He answered the call, his heart racing. "Hello?" "Darnell." Jasmine's voice came through the line, calm but firm. "We won." For a moment, Darnell didn't know how to respond. The words hung in the air, almost unreal. "We won?" he repeated as if he needed to hear it again. Jasmine laughed softly. "Yes, we won. The city's policy is being overturned. They've agreed to give you the contract." The weight that had been pressing down on Darnell's chest for weeks suddenly lifted, replaced by a flood of relief, disbelief, and gratitude. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the reality of it sank in. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Jasmine's smile was evident even through the phone. "You earned this, Darnell. You fought for it. Now go show them what you're made of." That evening, Darnell stood outside the church, staring up at the darkening sky. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. The city contract was his. The future he had once thought was impossible was now within reach. As he stood there, the familiar words from Jeremiah echoed in his mind. "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Darnell had walked a long, difficult road to get here, but through it all, his faith had remained. And now, standing on the other side of the fight, he realized that the struggle had been part of the plan all along, because without the fight, he wouldn't have discovered the strength that had always been inside him. The morning of the first city contract job was heavy with promise. Darnell stood in the early light, staring at the expanse of green parkland that stretched out before him, dotted with trees and overgrown patches of grass. It was a far cry from the small yards and residential lots he had grown used to, but it filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in a long time. This was it, the big time. He had worked so hard to get here, and yet, standing at the edge of this new beginning, the weight of it hit him full force. It wasn't just the job itself. It was what the job represented. The fight, the victories, the countless times he had doubted himself. Everything had led to this moment. And now, the city contract was his. His crew was ready. His tools were ready, but most importantly, Darnell was ready. Marcus arrived early, as he always did. The young man had grown into his role over the last few months, moving from a nervous apprentice to a confident worker. Darnell could see a lot of himself in Marcus, someone who just needed a chance, a break, someone to believe in him. And now, as Marcus hopped out of the truck, flashing a grin, Darnell realized that he had become the kind of mentor he'd once needed. "Morning, boss," Marcus said, the grin widening as he surveyed the park. "Big day." "Yeah," Darnell replied, glancing over at him. "You ready for it?" Marcus chuckled. "I've been ready. Question is, are you?" Darnell smiled despite the nerves tightening in his chest. "Let's find out." The team began unloading the equipment, the familiar sounds of clattering tools and engines roaring to life filling the air. This wasn't like any job they'd done before. This was public property, with city officials keeping an eye on the results. The stakes were higher, but Darnell knew that they were capable of handling it. They had done the work to get here, and now it was time to show the city and everyone else what they could do. As the day progressed, Darnell moved from section to section of the park, overseeing the team, giving instructions, and occasionally rolling up his sleeves to handle the work himself. He felt the weight of responsibility more than ever before. This was his business, his name and his reputation on the line, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. By mid-afternoon, things were running smoothly. The team had already tackled the largest sections of the park, clearing the overgrown grass, trimming the hedges, and shaping the flower beds. Darnell stood back for a moment, watching Marcus and the others move through their tasks with precision and care. It hit him then, how far they'd come. A truck pulled up along the curb, and Darnell saw Mr. Harris stepping out. His face split into a wide grin. He hadn't expected Harris to stop by, but he wasn't surprised either. Harris had been there from the beginning, and seeing the old man's approval meant more to Darnell than he could say. "Look at you," Harris said, walking up to Darnell with a slow clap. "Running the show like you've been doing it for years." Darnell laughed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Still figuring it out as I go." "That's what all the greats do," Harris replied, his eyes scanning the park, taking in the work that had been done. "But I gotta say, I knew you'd get here. You've got that spark, Darnell, that drive. It's rare." Darnell's chest swelled with pride at Harris's words, but there was still a small part of him that couldn't shake the nagging doubt. "I don't know. Sometimes it still feels like I'm waiting for something to go wrong." Harris turned to him, his expression serious now. "That's just fear talking. You're here, Darnell. You fought for this. You earned it. Don't let fear tell you otherwise." Darnell nodded slowly, Harris's words settling deep inside him. He had earned this. Every battle, every moment of doubt, every time the world had told him he wasn't enough. He had fought through it all, and he had won. They worked through the rest of the day, and as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the park transformed from a neglected space to a place that people would want to visit again. The grass was neatly trimmed, the trees pruned, and the flower beds brought back to life. It was a good feeling, knowing that they had made something better, that they had brought beauty back to a place that had been forgotten. As the last of the equipment was packed up and the team gathered by the truck, Darnell felt a sense of pride and fulfillment that he hadn't expected. The job was done, and it was done well. Better than well. It was something he could be proud of. He looked around at his crew, Marcus by his side, and felt the weight of the moment. This was what success felt like. Not just the paycheck or the contract, but the realization that he had built something real, something that mattered. "Good work today, everyone," Darnell said, his voice carrying over the group. "We did it." The team cheered, clapping each other on the back, the energy high after a hard day's work. But for Darnell, it wasn't just about today. It was about the future. This contract was just the beginning, a step toward something even bigger. As the crew packed up and left for the night, Darnell lingered for a moment longer, standing in the park and watching the light fade from the sky. The city lights flickered on in the distance, and he could hear the hum of traffic, the low murmur of people going about their lives. It was a quiet moment, but it was filled with the promise of what was to come. Darnell thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the battles he had fought, against the system, against his own doubts, against the world's expectations. He thought about the people who had helped him along the way, Pastor Marcus, Mr. Harris, Jasmine. They had all believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. He remembered the day he had walked out of prison, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a shroud. He had thought that his life would always be defined by those 10 years behind bars, that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be able to escape the mistakes of his past. But now, standing in this park, with his business growing and his future bright, Darnell realized that he had been wrong. The past didn't define him. It had shaped him, yes, but it didn't own him. He had taken control of his life, built something from nothing, and proved to himself and the world that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. The world hadn't made it easy, but he had made it through anyway. As he stood there, the familiar words from Jeremiah came back to him, echoing softly in his mind. "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Darnell smiled to himself, the peace of the moment washing over him. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He had a future, a real future, one that he had fought for, one that he had earned. And for the first time in a long time, Darnell wasn't afraid of what was to come. The weeks after the city contract rolled in like a wave of momentum. The work was steady, the team was solid, and the phone didn't stop ringing. Darnell's business was thriving in a way he had only dreamed about months earlier. His days were long, filled with planning, managing jobs, and leading his team, but there was something different about the weight he carried now. It wasn't the crushing pressure of survival anymore. It was the sturdy, fulfilling weight of purpose. More contracts came in, a few more parks, then a government building, even some larger commercial spaces. Word spread quickly about Darnell's company, not just about the quality of the work, but about the man behind it. The story of a black man who had once been behind bars and now owned a successful business resonated with people in ways Darnell hadn't anticipated. He was building something bigger than just a landscaping company. He was building a legacy. One afternoon while working on a city park, Marcus approached Darnell, his face serious but excited. "Darnell, you got a minute?" Marcus asked, pulling off his gloves and wiping the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, what's up?" Darnell replied, taking a break from adjusting one of the trimmers. Marcus hesitated for a second, his eyes flicking toward the rest of the team before focusing back on Darnell. "I've been thinking about what you did for me. You gave me a chance when no one else would. I want to do the same." Darnell raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Marcus shifted his weight, looking a little nervous. "I've got this cousin, Jerome. He just got out, and, well, he's having a hard time. He's looking for work, but no one will give him a shot. You know how it is. I was thinking maybe he could come on and help out for a while. I know he's rough around the edges, but he's a good kid. He just needs someone to believe in him." Darnell's heart clenched at the familiar story. He saw so much of himself in Marcus, and now Marcus was standing in front of him, ready to pay that belief forward. It was a full circle moment, one that Darnell hadn't expected, but felt deeply. He looked Marcus in the eye and nodded. "Bring him on. We'll give him the chance he needs." Marcus's face lit up with gratitude, and Darnell felt a swell of pride, not just in Marcus, but in the fact that he was now in a position to help others the way Mr. Harris had helped him. This was how it started. One person reaching back, helping another up. And with that, the seeds of Darnell's legacy began to take root. Jerome joined the crew a week later. He was quiet at first, unsure of his place, his movements tentative as he learned the ropes. Darnell watched him closely, remembering what it had felt like to be the new guy, the one trying to prove himself while carrying the weight of his past. Jerome was eager to learn, though, and Darnell made sure to give him the space to grow, just as Harris had done for him. Over the next few months, more young men like Jerome came to Darnell's door, men who had been in and out of the system, who couldn't find a way forward because the world wouldn't give them the chance. Darnell hired them, taught them, and gave them the tools they needed to not just survive, but to thrive. Slowly, his business became more than just a landscaping company. It became a place of redemption, a space where people could rebuild their lives. One evening, Darnell was sitting in his office, a small, modest space he had set up in the corner of the equipment shed, when Pastor Marcus called. The pastor's voice was warm, as it always was, but there was something different in his tone this time. "I've been hearing about what you're doing, Darnell," Marcus said. "Hiring these young men? Giving them a second chance. You know, the church has been thinking about starting a vocational program for some of the folks in the community, teaching them skills, helping them find work. I was wondering if you'd be interested in getting involved." Darnell leaned back in his chair, surprised but humbled. He hadn't realized that people were paying attention to what he was doing, at least not beyond his clients. But the thought of partnering with the church, of using his business as a platform to help even more people, lit a fire inside him. "Yeah," Darnell said, a smile spreading across his face. "I'd love to." The vocational program came together over the next few months, with Darnell playing a central role. He and Pastor Marcus worked closely, designing workshops where Darnell and his team taught landscaping, basic business skills, and financial literacy. The church's community hall, once used only for Sunday services and potlucks, became a hub for young men and women looking for a way out of the cycle of poverty and incarceration. Darnell found himself standing in front of a group of young people every week, sharing his story, not just about his time in prison, but about how he had built something from nothing, how faith and hard work had brought him to where he was now. Each time he told his story, it reminded him of how far he had come and how much further he wanted to go. He watched as some of the people who came through the program joined his crew. Others started their own small ventures, and some simply found jobs where they hadn't been able to before. Each success, no matter how small, felt like a victory, a step toward something bigger. One late summer evening, after a long day of work, Darnell sat outside his house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm, and the hum of cicadas filled the space around him. He thought about everything that had happened in the past year, the growth of his business, the battles he had fought and won, and the people whose lives had intersected with his in ways he could never have predicted. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Mr. Harris. "I heard about the vocational program," Harris said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "You're doing good, Darnell." "Real good," Darnell smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I learned from the best." Harris laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "You're building something bigger than any of us imagined. It's not just about the business anymore, is it?" "No," Darnell replied, his voice soft but sure. "It's not. It's about giving people a way forward. Showing them that there's more out there for them, that their past doesn't have to define their future." "That's a legacy," Harris said, his tone full of approval. "And it's yours." Darnell sat in the quiet that followed, Harris's words lingering in the air. He hadn't set out to build a legacy, but now, looking back on everything, he realized that's exactly what he had done. His business wasn't just about cutting grass and trimming hedges. It was about giving people a chance to start over, to believe in themselves, to see the world in a way they hadn't before. As the night settled in around him, Darnell thought about what lay ahead. There was still so much more to do, more people to help, more ground to cover. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't just looking forward. He was looking up, knowing that the plan God had for him was still unfolding, and he was ready for it. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant sounds of the city coming to life. Darnell stood in the park, the same park where his first big city contract had taken place. But today wasn't about work. Today was about celebration. His crew was scattered around the park, laughing and talking, setting up tables with food and chairs for the guests who would arrive soon. It was a small gathering. His team, some of the people from the church, a few clients, and of course, Mr. Harris and Pastor Marcus. Darnell looked around, taking it all in. The park, now neat and manicured, was more than just a place of work. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had built. Standing here, surrounded by the people who had been part of his journey, Darnell couldn't help but feel the weight of how much his life had changed. He thought back to the day he had walked out of prison, unsure of what the future held. He had felt like the world was still caged around him, a vast and indifferent place that didn't care whether he succeeded or failed. But now, standing here, he realized that he had created his own future. He had broken the chains that had once held him down, and in their place, he had built something stronger, something lasting. "Hey, boss," Marcus called from across the park, waving Darnell over with a grin. "Come help us with this banner." Darnell walked over, shaking his head with a smile. "You're the one with all the energy, Marcus. I'm just trying to keep up." Marcus laughed as they worked together to string the banner between two trees. The banner read, "Celebrating the Future, Darnell's Landscaping Community Vocational Program." It was simple, but it said everything Darnell had worked for. His business and the program that had become the heart of his legacy. As they finished setting up, people began arriving, filling the park with laughter and chatter. Darnell moved through the crowd, greeting each person, his heart swelling with gratitude. There was Jerome, who had come so far since his first day on the job, now one of the most reliable members of the team. There were clients who had become friends, people who had trusted him not just with their yards, but with their belief in what he was building. Darnell found a quiet moment, leaning against a tree as he watched the scene unfold. Pastor Marcus joined him, holding 2 cups of lemonade, offering one to Darnell. "You've built something beautiful here," Marcus said, his voice low and full of pride. "It's not just about the business, is it?" Darnell shook his head, taking a sip of the lemonade. "No, it's not. It started that way, but it's become so much more." "You've given people hope?" Marcus continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "That's no small thing. You've given them a future, Darnell. And that's what real transformation looks like." Darnell nodded, feeling the weight of Marcus's words settle in his chest. It was true. The men and women who had come through his vocational program, the people he had hired and mentored, they weren't just employees. They were part of something larger, a community, a family of people who had found their way out of the darkness. "You remember what I said when you first came to the church?" Marcus asked, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I told you God had a plan for you." Darnell chuckled. "Yeah, I remember. I didn't believe it at the time." "And now?" Marcus asked, his gaze steady. Darnell paused, looking around at the faces of the people who had become so important to him. He thought about the journey, the struggles, the victories, and the way his faith had grown through it all. He thought about how lost he had once felt, and how now, standing here, he finally understood what Marcus had meant. "I believe it now," Darnell said, his voice quiet but certain. "I believe it because I've seen it. God had a plan, and it's more than I ever could have imagined." Marcus smiled, clapping Darnell on the shoulder. "You've come a long way, my friend, and you're just getting started." Darnell nodded, feeling the truth of those words deep in his soul. He wasn't done yet. There was still so much more to do, more people to help, more lives to touch. But for the first time in his life, Darnell wasn't afraid of the future. He was ready for it. As the day went on, Darnell found himself surrounded by laughter and conversation. The celebration was small, but it was full of joy, a reflection of everything his journey had become. At one point, Harris pulled him aside, his face serious, but full of pride. "You've done something real here, Darnell," Harris said. "You've built a business, sure, but more than that, you've built a place where people can find their way. You've given them something to believe in." Darnell felt a lump form in his throat. Harris had been there from the start, had seen him through the worst of his doubts and struggles. Without Harris's guidance, none of this would have been possible. "I couldn't have done it without you," Darnell said honestly. Harris waved him off, grinning. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You did the hard work." Darnell smiled, his heart full. "Thank you, Harris, for everything." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them taking in the scene. The laughter, the people, the sense of community that had grown around Darnell's business. "You know," Harris said, his voice soft but full of meaning, "you're not just running a business anymore. You're running a movement." The words hit Darnell in a way he hadn't expected. A movement. It wasn't just about the yards they cleaned or the contracts they won. It was about the lives they touched, the hope they spread, the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Darnell realized that this was what he had been building all along, a legacy that would last long after he was gone. That night, after the celebration had ended and the park was quiet again, Darnell sat alone on a bench, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky. His thoughts drifted back to all the people who had helped him along the way: Pastor Marcus, Harris, Jasmine, even the men who had worked alongside him in prison. Each of them had played a part in his journey, and now he was playing a part in someone else's. He pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, where he had written down the verse from Jeremiah that had been his anchor through it all. "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Darnell smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of peace. He had fought hard to get to this point, but he knew now that he hadn't been fighting alone. God had been with him every step of the way, guiding him, shaping him, and leading him toward a future he hadn't been able to see. The future still stretched out before him, full of unknowns, full of challenges. But now Darnell wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He had built something strong, something lasting, something that mattered, a legacy. And as he sat there in the quiet of the night, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it.